All right, this is the video for our week 7 film, Three Times, made by Ho Xiaoxian in 2005. So I said a little bit about the film today in class, and I think I called it something like Ho Xiaoxian to the highest degree of Ho Xiaoxian. Um, I love this film. It's a mind blower. I think it's really stunning in a certain way. And I think it becomes a mind blower and it becomes stunning with some thought about it. As we watch it this first time, if you've never seen it before, of course, it might not immediately present itself as a stunning film or a mind-blowing film. But it is known to be just one of his just very finest works. The Guardian newspaper in England called it the highest of high cinematic art. So we're going to proceed with that understanding, that kind of expert opinion. And of course, everyone has their own taste and their own preferences and things. But I think the goal here, we're going to work with this film that's really challenging in many ways, but I think has a lot to offer if we really dig in and try to get a lot out of it. It'll have these incredible still moments like we've already gotten to know with Ho in Dust in the Wind. It's a long film as well. It runs something, I didn't write down the run time. Here it is, it runs 2 hours. And may feel like a little bit more than that at certain times. But anyway, I think that we couldn't really have this class on Taiwan film and history without watching this film. So I'm hoping that we can do some work and do some preparing for it. And I think the reviews, I've enclosed 5 film reviews in the syllabus. They're on Canvas as well. And I think that with the assistance of these kinds of things, I think it's possible to really get a lot out of this movie. So Roger Ebert had a review, and this is from his website, and this is actually one of the reviews we're looking at, but I'm just reading the first paragraph of his review just to help us kind of get into our discussion here. 3 stories about a man and a woman, all 3 using the same actors. 3 years, 1966, 1911, 2005. 3 varieties of love: unfulfilled, mercenary, meaningless. All photographed with such visual beauty that watching the movie is like holding your breath so the butterfly won't stir. And he goes on to write, the director is Ho Xiaoxian from Taiwan. He misspells Taiwan. And this will probably be the first of his 17 films you've seen. The movie distribution system of North America is devoted to maintaining a wall between you and Ho Xiaoxian, I wrote, says Ebert, after seeing this film at Cannes in 2005. And he mentions that in a 1988 Worldwide Critics poll, Ho was championed as one of the 3 directors most crucial to the future of cinema. What's interesting, though, is that Ebert, so this review talks about his real appreciation of the film, but towards the bottom of it, he says there's actually no deep message, which I think is interesting. And I think that we'll actually see some deep messages in it. And I think that we'll try to work towards that. So even though he's one of the greats of kind of film critique and things like that, I don't quite buy his point there that there's no deep message. I think it's a really interesting movie. So with a lot to it. Other reviewers, I forget if this is one that we're reading for the class, but someone else writes that the film is about how it feels to say goodbye, knowing that you're about to separate from a person. And so all 3 stories, again, set in 1966, 1911, and 2005, in that order, which is, of course, out of chronological order. We'll share, again, the main actors, but looking at relationships and the nature of this kind of imminent separation in 3 very different ways. In an interview, Ho was talking about this film pretty shortly after he made it in the mid-2000s. And so I'll mention that the Chinese title, so the English title is Three Times. Chinese title is actually The Best Times, 最好的时光. It means the best times. And so it's interesting that it gets translated as 3 times. It's a little bit too literal. I think it really dumbs down the title for us. And what Ho says in an interview is, the best moments of an era aren't what the politicians tell us. And so if we go back to what we were thinking with Dust in the Wind and the way that he wanted to kind of register this critique with what the politicians have told us about the economic miracle, I think we had a really good insight into that movie in that way. And I think a lot of you wrote about it in a really insightful way as well, with using that technique and that in. That Ho is on to a real experience. And that's, again, many of you wrote about Taiwan New Cinema, the representation of real people, real times, real choices. The idea, like I kept saying, that people do, in Ho's films, people do the things that they actually do. They make the choices and they say the things they often actually do. And so I thought that there's just an immediate connection between when he says this about, you know, what we talked about with Dust in the Wind, and then what he says here about 3 times. The best moments of an era aren't what the politicians tell us. And what he's after is the essence of an era. He says every period has a mood. And so he takes these 3 periods: the 60s, when he was young, when he was in military service, 1911, and then 2005. And he's after these stories using the same actors to tell a story that's kind of the essence of that time, and that these are the best times, even though the stories are all about separation and loss in different kinds of ways. So I think it's quite deep. You know, not to quibble too much more with Ebert, but I think that you know, already Ho has gotten us into some pretty interesting territory. Ho is both very politically involved as a person, with very definite ideas about politics as a person, but he says, I don't like to put it in my films. It's always going on in the background. It's driving the things that happen in the films, but I don't like to put those political moments in the films. And so again, Dust in the Wind would be a great example of that, I think. And so he talks about these 3 times of, so 1966, and that's the one that comes first. And so that's the scene that we see here. This actress, Shu Qi, is working in a pool hall. And so her role, and what we'll see is that she's one of the young women that work in the pool halls, just to kind of keep the men company, and they're pretty and they're dressed nicely and they kind of run the place and they collect money and things like that. Ho talked about the popularity of these little pool halls. And so literally this would be like the ground floor of someone's house, and they would just put a pool table in and a chalkboard. And what made them very popular was that you didn't have to have a license to open one of these, as opposed to any other kind of business. The KMT was very strict about registering your businesses and things like that. But a pool hall like this didn't need a license. And so he said that you'd see them all over the place. And there would be these networks. And so what we see is that these women kind of move from pool hall to pool hall, even from town to town, in some sort of network of these. And so that's the background here. And so he says that this story is actually based on his own experience, being in the military, having some time off, going to play pool, being really attracted to one of these young women that works there and trying to find her the next time he comes back, and writing letters to her. And so we've already seen that Ho, we already know that he's interested in things like that, like the letters, and that when people are gone, and what people need, and that separation. But he's telling this from his own story. A lot of people like this story the best. So that probably shouldn't surprise us that maybe it means the most to Ho in some way. It's followed by a story set in 1911. And so Ho talks about it as a doomed relationship. And so, you know, we'll see the same main 2 actors, main, you know, male and female actors, and actually another of the kind of secondary female actor as well. But it's a doomed relationship, and it's a woman who works in, she's a courtesan, and it's kind of along the lines of the geisha model that you may be familiar with in Japan, which actually comes from China originally. And it's the woman who's very skilled in the arts and is trained in poetry and music and accompanies men, entertains men. And then there's also a sexual component to that too, sometimes. Not always, not for any person, but sometimes. And so we'll see in that film, sorry, in that section of this film, what we'll see is Shuqi here playing a courtesan. And so we'll understand that she got to this, to call it a brothel isn't right. It's not the right terminology, but it's maybe it's evocative of eventually kind of what it signifies. But a tea house with entertainment for men provided by women that's usually on the level of poetry and music, but then can proceed to more personal things than that. And the male actor plays a newspaper writer who's really interested in trying to gain freedom from Japanese rule. So again, it's set in 1911, which is 16 years into Japanese rule of Taiwan. And so it happens in 1911 that Liang Qichao, who was a really important, very famous reformer in the Qing dynasty, who made the Qing dynasty angry by the reforms he was proposing, he had to flee to Japan. And so so he's a really important person in Chinese history, one of the great thinkers of the late 19th century, early 20th century. And in 1911, he did visit Taiwan. I went from Japan to Taiwan for a couple of weeks. And so this film, this section of the film takes that as an as a place to imagine then this newspaper man and his work to kind of introduce Liang Qichao to Japanese ruled Taiwan. And they're both, so it represents the people who are still hoping to get freedom from under Japanese rule. So one thing I didn't mention is that the three parts of the film they all have subtitles. And so the one you see pictured here in 1966 is called A Time for Love. And the one in 1911 is called A Time for Freedom. And so it's again, Taiwanese people who are hoping to become free of Japanese rule, because up to that point, it's been pretty rough. The first 15, 16 years of Japanese rule are rough. And so they're still looking to China. It's still close enough in time that Taiwan still kind of remembers being part of the Qing dynasty and thinking that there might be that connection. I mean, I think what we have to understand over time is that after 34 more years, by the end of World War II, that's harder to understand. Taiwan had become very Japanese. Taiwanese people had become Japanese subjects, had really become integrated into Japanese culture. And so it was much more difficult in 1945, say, to look at China and think like that's a place that we really have a lot in common with, and that's our destiny. But in 1911, when the second part of the film is set, that's the basis for it. You'll see that the male actor has his hair is in the style of the Manchu queue, which is shaved in the front, and then the long, the long queue in the back. And so we can talk about that. That's actually enforced by the Manchu government. So it's interesting that under Japanese rule, that's a way that Taiwanese people could show their kind of Chineseness, even though in China, that hairstyle is imposed on people by the Manchus. It was a hairstyle that men had to wear in Qing Dynasty China. We can talk about that more. The third part of the film, just to move on to that, then we'll jump all the way to 2005. And so it starts with the same two main actors on a motorcycle. And Shu here will play a character who's an artist. She's a photographer. She's a blogger. She's a singer in the kind of like a shoegaze style band we see playing in a club. We see that she has several health problems that she writes about. And that is a really this part of the film is going to be really challenging. And so I think, as I was saying, I think the first part is probably the most popular part because it's the easiest to understand. It's this kind of innocent picture of the 60s. The 1911 segment is filmed as a silent movie, and so it will seem slow in many ways for that reason. Then the 2005 segment will also have a lot of scenes of real like alienation and quietness and this kind of some of these same questions of modern life. And people, in the first two segments, people write letters to each other. In the 2005 segment, it's text messages, it's emails. And so we're back into that same kind of question that we talked about a lot with the terrorizers: isolation, alienation in Taipei. And so we'll see that both the main male and female characters both have girlfriends that they're cheating on. And we'll see them not seeming to really smile very much. And it's a painful relationship. And so it's a painful, I think, segment of the film, in many ways, because it's not a really pretty picture of Taipei in the 2000s. Ho calls it chaotic, and he says he's really after that look about, that's what he felt like the 2000s were about. I should mention that segment, again, which is about this real isolation and about cheating and lying, it has a scene towards the very end that is hard to make out exactly what's happening. And so the review on the website called Senses of Cinema, that's in the syllabus, it's on Canvas. The Senses of Cinema review explains in some detail the suicide that happens off camera at the end of the third segment of the film. I'd really recommend looking at that. I don't mean to spoil the plot of things, but I also felt like, as we were talking about earlier today, I just have to say something about that. That's upsetting to me. It must be upsetting to many of you. The good thing is we don't see it. And a lot of people don't really understand it's happened when they watch the movie, but it definitely happens. And that review actually kind of explains how it works off camera, which mercifully, like I said, we don't have to see it. But I do want to mention that's at the end of the third part of the film. And so maybe I would just, I wanted just to talk about those three segments and just kind of what we're seeing and have it make some sense in that way. But again, I think it's really interesting. And so I think we'll want to think about the idea of having the same actors play couples in these three moments, and the nature of their relationships, and how they're really, the way that they're going to be separated from each other is really defined by that time. That it's different kinds of separation. Some are more optimistic, some are more dreary. But I think it's an interesting way then to tell a story. And again, remember that the film's title in Chinese is The Best Times. So I think we'd really want to think about, after we watch it and talk about it, why these are the best times necessarily. But besides the actors, besides that theme, music is really important. Music is quite important in all three segments. And so I think we'll want to try to figure out the nature of the music that's in the three segments of the film and what it does. It's very clearly a big part of telling the story for Ho. Which, as I think people were talking about in Dust of the Wind, wasn't true. I think that there was often this great silence or just kind of background noise. And so it's interesting this time that there's so much music that he's using to tell the story. The role of communications. And so here we see Shu Qi reading a letter from the main male actor, but again, letters or emails and texts. And I think that's also at the heart. There's something about that seems to really compel him. to make it something that he wants to capture as defining a moment, an era. I meant to also say that the third segment that's set in 2005, what Ho says about that is that, because I wanted to bring in the political part of that too, that he says that in 2004 there was a really bitter presidential election, and he felt like the politics in Taiwan were absolutely split. That Taiwan was kind of split into two halves politically. And so he sees the 2005 segment of this film as a way of talking about that split. Again, even though, as I said, he doesn't put anything political in this part of the film, or in any part of the film. But it's behind him telling the story about these young people and this relationship. And the background of that is some sense of his about the split in Taiwanese society. And so what reminded me, of course, is this book. And so for next week, I'm asking you to read what I think are the last couple chapters, chapters 7 and 8 of Lu's book. And so it's essentially after she's out of prison by the 80s and then into the 90s and the 2000s, her work for Taiwan independence, her work to get Taiwan into the United Nations. She's a great example, in fact, of actually the kind of divisive forces. So I think we've talked about that before, that she's really smart, really strong, really powerful, but her effect, I think, politically has been one of kind of divisiveness for probably all sorts of reasons. And so I think that in that sense, again, I think that this book has been a really good one for helping us to understand the background at different moments, especially as it regards women in Taiwan. And so again, this is not that those political insights about the UN or Taiwan independence really figure into that third part of the film, but again, it's all about that tension that Ho at least feels when he's making the movie. There are a couple of articles, journal articles that I put in the syllabus as well, and I realized I think one of them is about, it's an analysis of the Taiwanese edition of Cosmopolitan magazine in the 90s. And then the next one I'm looking at, and I think I may have accidentally put it in the wrong week, because it's called Choosing the Right to Choose, Roe versus Wade and the Feminist Movement to Legalize Abortion in Martial Law, Taiwan. And I may have wanted to have that in the personals week, and I may have just put that in the wrong week somehow. But both these articles, I think, are helping us understand the different images of women and the different kind of political forces that women are creating and facing at this time. And so I think that that will also help us understand this last segment of 3 Times. So again, I'll be showing it Friday, and I hope you can join me Friday, and I'll see you all soon.